When you think of General Douglas MacArthur, you likely picture the aviator glasses, the corncob pipe, and the triumphant return to the Philippines. You think of a military genius who masterminded the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. But behind every polished bronze statue lies a foundation of mud, blood, and catastrophic miscalculation. Before the triumphs of late 1944, there was the late autumn of 1942 on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. There was a place called Buna and its neighbouring villages of Gona and Sanananda. This was not a glorious battlefield of sweeping armoured manoeuvres or grand naval clashes. It was a prehistoric, disease-ridden swamp where American boys, completely unprepared for jungle warfare, were thrown into a meat grinder by a commander sitting comfortably in a hotel room over 1,000 miles away. This is the story of MacArthur's Jungle Hell, a campaign that exposed the fatal flaws of one of America's most famous generals and nearly broke the United States Army in the Pacific. How does a modern military machine, backed by the greatest industrial power on Earth, find itself relying on native canoes and blind frontal assaults against invisible bunkers? We are going to dig deep into the tactical nightmares, the logistical failures, and the brutal reality of the Battle of Buna-Gona. Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the Hollywood myths and analyze the cold, hard facts of military history. If you want to understand what really happens when grand strategy collides with the unforgiving realities of the battlefield, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts on MacArthur's leadership, and let us dive into the green hell of New Guinea. To understand why American and Australian troops were bleeding out in a swamp at the edge of the world, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic chessboard of the Pacific. For decades prior to the outbreak of World War II, the United States Navy had been developing War Plan Orange, a blueprint for a hypothetical war with Imperial Japan. This plan largely envisioned a massive Mahanian fleet engagement somewhere in the central Pacific. It assumed a slow, methodical push across the Marshall and Caroline Islands. Nobody in the war departments of the 1920s or 30s was drawing up logistical tables for fighting in the Owen Stanley Mountains or the coastal swamps of Papua. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire, starved of oil, rubber, and iron by Western embargoes, launched its lightning offensive in December 1941. Their goal was the southern resource area, primarily the Dutch East Indies, but to secure those resources, they had to isolate Australia. If Australia remained a viable staging ground for the Allies, the Japanese defensive perimeter would always be vulnerable. This strategic reality made the island of New Guinea, a massive, uncharted landmass sitting just north of Australia, the most important piece of real estate in the Southwest Pacific. By mid-1942, the Japanese had attempted to take Port Moresby, the key Allied base on the southern coast of New Guinea, by sea, but were turned back at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Undeterred, they landed on the northern coast at Buna-Gona in July, intending to march overland to Port Moresby via a narrow, brutal footpath known as the Kokoda Track. The Australian forces, fighting a desperate, brilliant fighting retreat, finally halted the Japanese advance just 30 miles from Port Moresby. Starving, diseased, and overextended, the Japanese South Seas Detachment was ordered to fall back to their beachheads on the northern coast. They retreated to Buna-Gona and Sanananda, intending to build an impenetrable fortress to hold the coast until reinforcements could arrive. This is where Douglas MacArthur enters the tactical picture, and where his supreme arrogance began to write checks that his infantrymen had to pay for in blood. MacArthur had recently escaped the Philippines, leaving his doomed army behind on Bataan and Corregidor. He was a general without an army, haunted by the defeat and absolutely desperate for a victory to restore his prestige and justify his demands for more resources from Washington. The Joint Chiefs in Washington, led by General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, had committed to a Europe-first strategy. The Pacific was a secondary theatre, and within the Pacific, the Navy's drive through the Solomon Islands, specifically Guadalcanal, was getting the lion's share of attention and supplies. MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area from his headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, looked at his maps and saw an opportunity. He saw the Japanese retreating back to the northern coast of New Guinea, and he assumed they were a broken, disorganized mob waiting to be swept into the sea. He looked at the map, drew a few arrows, and ordered the Australian 7th Division and the United States 32nd Infantry Division to advance and crush the beachhead. Did the Supreme Commander actually know what was happening, or was he fighting a war on a paper map? The reality was that MacArthur had no reliable intelligence on the terrain, the climate, or the enemy's defensive preparations. He was operating under the delusion that this would be a swift, decisive mopping-up operation. Let us break down the forces that were about to collide in this God-forsaken swamp, starting with the Japanese defenders. The Japanese forces at Buna-Gona and Sanananda numbered roughly 6,500 men by the time the Allies arrived, eventually reinforced to over 9,000. They were a mix of the South Seas Detachment, combat engineers, anti-aircraft units, and special naval landing forces, which were essentially Japanese Marines. These were not disorganized stragglers. They had spent months turning a stretch of coastline about 11 miles long into a masterpiece of field fortification. The terrain dictated their defense perfectly. The coastal strip was a nightmare of tidal swamps, impenetrable kunai grass that grew up to 7 feet tall, and dense jungle canopy that blocked out the sun. The water table was so high that you could not dig a standard trench without it filling with water within minutes. So the Japanese engineers did not dig down. They built up. They constructed hundreds of mutually supporting bunkers using coconut logs, which are incredibly dense and resilient to explosive impact. They reinforced these logs with steel plates, oil drums filled with sand, and coral rock. They covered the bunkers with earth and transplanted living jungle vegetation on top of them. Within a week, these pillboxes were completely invisible from a distance of 10 yards. The firing slits were positioned just above ground level, designed to sweep the narrow, muddy trails that were the only avenues of approach through the swamps. Their weapon systems were perfectly suited for this environment. The Japanese infantrymen carried the Arisaka Type 38 rifle, a weapon that fired a 6.5mm round. More importantly, the ammunition used a very clean-burning powder, meaning it produced almost no muzzle flash or smoke. A Japanese sniper could tie himself into the upper branches of a banyan tree, fire all day, and never give away his position. For heavier firepower, they relied on the Type 92 heavy machine gun, nicknamed the Woodpecker by Allied troops for its distinctive, slow rate of fire. Positioned in those reinforced coconut log bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, these machine guns created a wall of lead that could not be flanked because the surrounding swamp was impassable. The Japanese doctrine here was simple and fanatical. There was no retreat, no surrender, and no maneuver. They were ordered to hold the beachhead to the last man, buying time for the Imperial Japanese Navy to reorganize. Now, let us look at the instrument MacArthur chose to crack this fortress. the United States 32nd Infantry Division, known as the Red Arrow Division. This was a National Guard unit comprised mostly of men from Michigan and Wisconsin. Before the war, they had been trained for a conventional war in Europe. They were trained to fight in open fields, to maneuver in battalion formations, and to rely on heavy artillery and armoured support. In the summer of 1942, they were shipped to Australia and told they were going to be jungle fighters. Their preparation for this role was criminally inadequate. They received virtually no specialized training in jungle warfare, small unit tactics, or swamp navigation. Their equipment was completely unsuited for the environment they were about to enter. The standard uniform was the herringbone twill, which was heavy, did not breathe, and rotted off their bodies in the 90% humidity. They were issued standard leather combat boots that fell apart in the corrosive mud. Their primary weapon was the M1 Garand, a masterpiece of American engineering, but a heavy, complex rifle that required constant maintenance to prevent rusting in an environment that received up to 150 inches of rain a year. They carried heavy canvas webgear that absorbed water and added pounds to their load. Worse still, they were sent into combat without the heavy weapons necessary to reduce fortifications. Because MacArthur's staff believed the jungle was impassable for heavy equipment, the 32nd Division was stripped of most of its artillery. They were sent into the fight with only a handful of short-barreled 105mm howitzers, and they had absolutely no tank support. They were expected to destroy reinforced bunkers with rifles, bayonets, and hand grenades. This brings us to the most critical failure of the entire campaign, the logistics. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. MacArthur's staff in Brisbane had completely failed to comprehend the logistical nightmare of supplying an army on the northern coast of New Guinea. There were no roads, no deep water ports, and the waters off the coast were poorly charted and infested with coral reefs. The United States was churning out Liberty ships and Sherman tanks by the thousands back home, but none of that industrial might mattered if you could not get it to the front line. The Allies had to rely on a trickle of supplies flown over the Owen Stanley Mountains by unarmed C-47 Dakota transport planes. Because there were no secure airfields near the front initially, these supplies often had to be airdropped into the swamps, where half of them were lost in the mud or fell behind Japanese lines. The men of the 32nd Division were surviving on a fraction of their required daily caloric intake. They were eating cold, spoiled, canned rations, drinking stagnant swamp water, and suffering from a catastrophic lack of medical supplies. Before the first shot was even fired at Buna, the American forces were being decimated by the environment. Malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, and dysentery swept through the ranks. For every man who became a combat casualty, 3 to 5 men were incapacitated by disease. Temperatures routinely hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was so thick with mosquitoes that men would inhale them if they opened their mouths to breathe. When we look at military history, we see precedents for this kind of command failure. During the American Civil War, General Ambrose Burnside ordered repeated futile frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, completely ignoring the reality of the terrain and enemy firepower. During World War I, generals sitting in chateaus miles behind the lines ordered men to walk slowly into machine gun fire at the Somme, based on rigid timetables that had no connection to the reality of the battlefield. MacArthur was repeating these historical blunders, but he was doing it in a tropical environment that was actively trying to kill his men before the enemy even had a chance. He demanded aggressive action, he demanded speed, and he demanded results to feed the press back in the United States. He sent messages to his field commanders, accusing them of cowardice and lacking the fighting spirit, while he dined on steak in a climate-controlled room in Australia. The stage was set for a slaughter. On one side, a deeply entrenched, fanatical enemy holding perfect defensive terrain with invisible bunkers. On the other side, an exhausted, starving, disease-ridden American division stripped of its heavy weapons, led by commanders who were under immense political pressure to produce a quick victory. The men of the 32nd Division were about to step off the muddy trails and into the crosshairs of the Japanese woodpeckers. The theoretical war on paper was over, and the brutal, intimate violence of the jungle was about to begin. On November 16, 1942, the men of the United States 32nd Infantry Division waded into the coastal swamps. They were divided into two main assault groups, Urbana Force to the west and Warren Force to the east, tasked with converging on the Japanese strongholds at Buna. Almost immediately, the theoretical battle plan disintegrated upon contact with the physical reality of the jungle. To understand the sheer tactical nightmare these men faced, we have to examine the tools they carried into the fight. The American infantryman was armed primarily with the M1 Garand rifle. Weighing in at 9.5 pounds loaded, firing the .30 caliber M2 armor-piercing round, it was the greatest semi-automatic battle rifle in the world. But in the swamps of New Guinea, this masterpiece of engineering became a high-maintenance liability. The operating rod and gas cylinder were highly susceptible to the corrosive 90% humidity. If a soldier did not meticulously clean and oil his weapon every single day, the action would rust shut. But keeping a weapon clean while crawling through sulphurous, waist-deep mud was a physical impossibility. For close quarters, officers and non-commissioned officers carried the Thompson submachine gun. The heavy .45 caliber slug was a renowned man-stopper, ideal for sweeping a trench or a European street. Yet in the dense kunai grass that grew up to 7 feet high, the heavy, slow-moving bullet would often deflect off thick vines and hardwood branches, drastically reducing its effective range. Conversely, the Japanese defensive grid was perfectly calibrated for this exact environment. Their primary defensive weapon was the Type 92 heavy machine gun. Firing a 7.7mm round from 30-round feed strips, it had a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. The Japanese nested these weapons inside bunkers constructed from 3 to 5 tiers of native coconut logs. Why coconut logs? Because unlike oak or pine, which splinter and shatter when hit by high-velocity rounds, coconut wood is fibrous, dense, and spongy. It literally absorbs the kinetic energy of small arms fire and shrapnel like a giant shock absorber. The Japanese engineers packed the gaps with coral rock and sand, creating a pillbox that was virtually immune to anything less than a direct hit from heavy artillery. Why did the Americans not simply call in a massive artillery barrage and blow these bunkers to pieces? The answer is tragically simple, and it points directly back to the catastrophic logistical planning at MacArthur's headquarters. His staff had decided that moving heavy artillery through the jungle was too difficult, so they simply did not bring it. The entire 32nd Division was supported by exactly 2 105mm howitzers and a handful of 75mm pack howitzers, which were severely rationed on ammunition. They had no naval gunfire support, and the dense jungle canopy made close air support wildly inaccurate. The American infantry was sent to assault reinforced concrete and coconut log fortresses with nothing but rifles, bayonets, and fragmentation grenades. This was a tactical regression of the highest order. It was the Wilderness Campaign of 1864 all over again. Just as Ulysses S. Grant's army stumbled blindly through the dense Virginia thickets, suffering horrific friendly fire and unable to see Confederate breastworks until they were at point-blank range, the Americans at Buna were fighting a completely blind war. When Urbana force pushed down a muddy track toward a Japanese salient known as the Triangle, they were instantly pinned down. The Japanese had cut narrow fire lanes through the kunai grass, creating invisible kill zones. An American platoon would advance. The jungle would suddenly erupt in smokeless muzzle flashes, and half the men would be cut down before they even knew they were under attack. How do you assault an interlocking machine gun nest when you cannot even stand up without getting your head taken off? You crawl. Men spent days on their bellies in the fetid muck, inching forward under a continuous canopy of lead. The physical toll was beyond human endurance. The water table was so high that foxholes immediately filled with water. Soldiers slept, ate, and fought while submerged in a soup of mud, human waste, and rotting corpses. Trench foot, jungle rot, and severe ringworm became universal. By late November, the offensive had ground to a bloody, catastrophic halt. Major General Edwin Harding, commanding the 32nd Division, was a competent officer, but he was fighting a 20th century battle with 19th century constraints. His men were starving, surviving on a single ration of cold, mouldy canned beef a day. The malaria rate was skyrocketing, pulling more men off the line than Japanese bullets. Back in his comfortable headquarters in Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur was entirely detached from this reality. He was reading press reports that criticized the lack of progress, and his ego could not handle the stain on his reputation. He summoned Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger, the commander of the First Corps. MacArthur's orders to Eichelberger were theatrical, ruthless, and completely devoid of tactical nuance. He told Eichelberger to go to the front, relieve Harding, and take Buna, or not come back alive. Eichelberger arrived at the front lines on December 1, 1942, and was horrified by what he found. He did not find cowards. He found a broken, emaciated army. Men were shivering with fever, their uniforms rotting off their backs, their eyes hollowed out by the constant, invisible terror of jungle combat. Eichelberger immediately relieved General Harding and several regimental commanders, a brutal but arguably necessary shock to the command structure. More importantly, Eichelberger realized that screaming at infantrymen to charge machine guns was a strategy for mass suicide. He demanded heavy firepower and armor. He managed to coordinate with the Australians to bring up a handful of M3 Stuart light tanks. Let us analyze the M3 Stuart in this specific theatre. Weighing 15 tons, armed with a 37mm main gun and three 30-caliber machine guns, the Stuart was considered a tin can by European theatre standards. Its frontal armour was only 1.5 inches thick, making it highly vulnerable to German anti-tank guns. But in the claustrophobic swamps of New Guinea, the Stuart was a game-changing mobile pillbox. The Japanese at Buna had very few dedicated anti-tank weapons. When the Stuarts finally rolled into the line at Warren Force, they crushed the kunai grass, exposing the hidden Japanese bunkers. The tanks would drive right up to the coconut logs and fire high-explosive 37mm shells directly into the firing slits. This dynamic is incredibly similar to the American experience in the Argonne Forest in 1918. During World War I, American doughboys were being slaughtered by hidden German machine gun nests in dense woods, until the arrival of French-supplied Renault light tanks provided the mobile armoured firepower necessary to break the deadlock. The Stuart tanks at Buna provided that exact same breakthrough capability. Meanwhile, just a few miles down the coast, the Australian 21st Brigade was fighting its own parallel nightmare at the village of Gona. The Australians, battle-hardened from the Middle East and the Kokoda track, found themselves locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the mud. The stench of death at Gona was so overpowering that pilots flying transport planes overhead reported smelling the rotting bodies from 1,000 feet in the air. Eichelberger had managed to stabilize the American command structure. He had brought up a meager but vital armored element, and he had finally forced the logistical chain to drop some hot food and desperately needed quinine to the front lines. The joint American and Australian forces were reorganizing, preparing for a massive, coordinated push to finally crack the Buna mission and Gona village. But the Japanese commander, Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama, was not beaten. He had saved his most fanatical defenders, his deepest trenches, and his most impenetrable bunkers for the final, desperate stand at the water's edge. The worst of the dying, the most savage close-quarters slaughter of the entire Pacific War, was still waiting in the dark waters ahead. The final reduction of the Japanese beachheads at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda was not a grand tactical sweep, but a grim, methodical extermination. By mid-December 1942, the American and Australian forces had pushed the surviving Japanese defenders into a shrinking perimeter backed directly against the Solomon Sea. The Japanese were completely cut off from resupply. The Imperial Japanese Navy, battered by the ongoing meat grinder at Guadalcanal, could no longer risk sending transport ships to the northern coast of New Guinea. The defenders were reduced to eating roots, grass, and eventually, the unthinkable. When Allied troops finally overran the last defensive pockets, they found the gruesome, undeniable evidence of cannibalism among the starving Japanese ranks. Yet, despite their emaciated state, the Japanese fought with a fanaticism that defied Western military logic. They did not surrender when surrounded, they did not retreat when outgunned, and they fought from their coconut log bunkers until they were burned out or blown apart at point-blank range. On the Australian front, the 21st Brigade finally broke the back of the Gona defences on December 9th, sending the famously terse radio message, "Gona is gone." For the Americans of the 32nd Division, the nightmare dragged on into January 1943. General Eichelberger had restored some semblance of tactical sanity, utilizing the handful of Stuart light tanks to systematically crush the remaining pillboxes. But how do you clear a bunker when the tank cannot reach it through the swamp? The American infantry had to invent modern jungle assault tactics through trial and blood. They developed a crude but effective system of suppression and flanking. One element would lay down a base of fire with Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garans, aiming directly at the narrow firing slits of the bunker to blind the Japanese machine gunners. Under this covering fire, an assault team would low-crawl through the mud, inching their way to the blind side of the pillbox. Once in position, they would lob fragmentation grenades or blocks of TNT directly into the air vents or the rear entrance. It was a terrifying, intimate form of warfare, where the distance between life and death was measured in inches. When the final Japanese stronghold at Sanananda fell on January 22, 1943, the silence that fell over the swamps was deafening. The battlefield was a horrifying moonscape of shattered palm trees, stagnant water, and thousands of unburied corpses baking in the tropical sun. The stench was so absolute that combat veterans claimed it clung to their uniforms and their skin for months afterward. The Battle of Buna-Gona was finally over, but the strategic and tactical autopsy was just beginning. When we analyze the aftermath of this campaign, we see the painful birth of the modern United States Army in the Pacific. The tactical lessons learned in the mud of New Guinea fundamentally altered how the Americans would fight for the rest of the war. First and foremost, the Army realized that conventional European doctrine was a death sentence in the jungle. The 32nd Division had gone into combat carrying heavy canvas gear, standard leather boots, and weapons that rusted overnight. In response to the Buna disaster, the military accelerated the development and deployment of specialized jungle equipment. They introduced nylon gear that would not rot, lightweight jungle boots with rubber soles for traction in the mud, and specialized rations designed to withstand the heat and humidity. They realized the absolute necessity of portable, devastating firepower for the infantry squad. The flamethrower, which was largely absent at Buna, would become the standard, terrifying tool for bunker reduction in future island campaigns. This evolution of tactics and equipment is strikingly similar to the paradigm shift we saw during World War I. Just as the British and French armies moved away from the rigid, suicidal mass infantry waves of the Somme in 1916 and evolved toward decentralized, heavily armed combined arms infiltration tactics by 1918, the United States Army at Buna learned that flexibility and specialized firepower were the only ways to break a fortified deadlock. But the most profound lesson of Buna was not tactical, it was strategic. General Douglas MacArthur, despite his massive ego and his refusal to admit fault, was quietly traumatized by the casualty figures. The Allies suffered over 3,000 men killed in action and thousands more wounded. But the true butcher was the jungle itself. Over 29,000 Allied soldiers became casualties due to tropical diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and scrub typhus. The 32nd Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, requiring months of rest and massive influxes of replacements before it could be fielded again. MacArthur looked at these numbers and realized a chilling truth. If the United States Army had to fight a Buna-style battle for every single Japanese stronghold across the Pacific, they would run out of American boys long before they reached Tokyo. This realization gave birth to the strategy of leapfrogging or island hopping. Instead of launching bloody frontal assaults against heavily fortified Japanese positions, MacArthur and his planners decided to bypass them. They would use their growing naval and air superiority to cut off the Japanese supply lines, isolate their fortresses, and leave them to wither on the vine. They would only assault the weakly defended islands that possessed flat terrain suitable for building airfields, allowing them to project land-based air power further up the chain toward Japan. Buna was the bloody laboratory that proved frontal assaults in the jungle were a strategic dead end. To understand how the disaster at Buna happened in the first place, we have to look at the catastrophic failure of Allied intelligence. The intelligence apparatus in the Southwest Pacific area was dominated by Major General Charles A. Willoughby, MacArthur's fiercely loyal and deeply flawed G2 officer. Willoughby suffered from the worst disease an intelligence officer can catch. He told his commander exactly what his commander wanted to hear. Before the battle, Willoughby estimated that there were perhaps a few thousand sick, starving, and disorganized Japanese troops at Buna. He completely ignored aerial reconnaissance photos that showed extensive defensive earthworks and camouflage. He projected American logistical difficulties onto the enemy, assuming that because the Americans were struggling to supply themselves, the Japanese must be completely broken. He was wrong by a factor of 3. There were over 9,000 deeply entrenched, highly motivated Japanese veterans waiting in the swamps. This kind of intelligence failure has devastating historical parallels. We can look back to the American Civil War and the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Union General George B. McClellan was constantly fed wildly exaggerated reports by the Pinkerton Detective Agency, making him believe he was vastly outnumbered by Confederate forces. This hallucination of a massive enemy army paralyzed McClellan, causing him to move with agonizing slowness and ultimately fail to capture Richmond. Willoughby did the exact opposite at Buna. He hallucinated a weak, non-existent enemy, pushing an unprepared American division into a buzzsaw. Both failures stemmed from command structures that molded intelligence to fit their preconceived psychological needs, rather than adapting their strategy to objective reality. From a logistical and economic perspective, Buna forced a total reimagining of how to supply a modern army in an archaic environment. The United States possessed the greatest industrial capacity on the planet. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were churning out thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and tons of ammunition. But the Battle of Buna proved that industrial might is absolutely useless if the final mile of the supply chain is a muddy footpath in a hostile jungle. The hero of the logistical war in New Guinea was not a ground commander. It was Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney realized that the only way to keep the infantry alive was to build an air bridge over the Owen Stanley Mountains. He commandeered every available C-47 transport plane and essentially invented modern tactical airlift doctrine on the fly. When artillery could not be dragged through the swamps, Kenney's pilots figured out how to dismantle 105mm howitzers, load them into transport planes, fly them to primitive dirt strips near the front, and reassemble them under fire. They perfected the art of low-level supply drops, kicking crates of ammunition and rations out the doors of aircraft flying just above the jungle canopy. Buna forced the American military to realize that in the Pacific theater, aviation was not just a combat arm, it was the fundamental backbone of all logistics. Yet, despite the incredible bravery of the men on the ground and the logistical miracles performed in the air, the political narrative surrounding Buna was a masterclass in deception. General MacArthur understood that his political survival and his demand for more resources from Washington depended on projecting an image of flawless victory. His press communiques, issued from his comfortable headquarters in Australia, were works of absolute fiction. He routinely reported that Allied casualties were light, that the Japanese were fleeing in terror, and that his brilliant strategic vision was unfolding perfectly. He actively censored any photographs or reports that showed dead American soldiers or the horrific conditions of the jungle. He wanted the American public to believe that the war in the Pacific was a clean, heroic crusade, led by a flawless genius. He even awarded himself the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the campaign, an act that deeply embittered the surviving veterans of the 32nd Division who had actually bled in the mud. This political manipulation of battlefield reality is eerily similar to the press briefings during the early years of the Vietnam War. Just as the Military Assistance Command Vietnam often prioritized positive body counts and optimistic press briefings prior to the Tet Offensive, MacArthur's headquarters manufactured a sterilized narrative, completely divorced from the butchery happening on the ground. In both cases, the High Command believed that managing public perception was just as important as managing the actual battle. But the men who fought at Buna knew the truth. They knew that they had been sacrificed on the altar of a general's ego, thrown into a battle they were not equipped to fight, against an enemy they did not understand. The Battle of Buna-Gona remains one of the darkest, most overlooked chapters in American military history. It was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers or glorious charges. It was a prehistoric struggle for survival in a rotting, disease-infested swamp. It exposed the fatal flaws of Douglas MacArthur, his arrogance, his detachment from reality, and his willingness to substitute the lives of his men for proper planning and logistics. But out of that jungle hell, a hardened, pragmatic, and lethal American military machine emerged. The men who survived Buna learned how to kill in the jungle, and the generals who survived the strategic shock learned how to bypass the Japanese strongholds. The road to Tokyo was paved with the bitter lessons learned in the mud of New Guinea. War is rarely the polished, heroic narrative we read in history books. It is often a desperate improvisation born from catastrophic mistakes. Now, I want to hear your perspective on MacArthur's command decisions during this brutal campaign. What was the primary reason for the disastrous early phases of the Battle of Buna-Gona? A. The complete lack of specialized jungle training and equipment for the American infantry. B. The catastrophic failure of Allied intelligence to accurately estimate Japanese troop strength. C. MacArthur's rigid adherence to conventional European tactics in a tropical environment. Let me know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.